Hello everyone, welcome to week number 2, and I wanted to show you a picture of what the Ashland campus looks like at Southern Oregon University. So those of you who are from out of the area can see what the university looks like, and I do hope you'll get a chance to visit the campus at least for your graduation. Let's look at where we're at this week. Online text links are available in Moodle in the Course Essential section. Please check the Moodle site every day, and if not every day, at least every few days. And remember to read the announcements as they come out. Our assigned readings this week are from Advanced Business Law, chapters 4 and 5, and I also want you to read the article on the Ford Pinto by Matthew Lee. It's located in the Business Ethics reading file, and that's also in the Course Essential section. And then after you've read all of this, go ahead and respond to the discussion question. Let's talk about Chapter 4 in Advanced Business Law, and this was all about the Constitution and regulation of U.S. commerce. And the important things to remember in this section are just kind of who does what. And you have the U.S. Supreme Court that has the power of judicial review, which means it can look at legislation that's passed by the different branches of government, or legislative branches of governments, state and local and federal, and it has the power of judicial review, saying we're going to determine whether that meets constitutional standards. And they talked a little bit about federalism, just how everything works together, who does what does the federal government do, what does the states do, and ultimately what does local government do, and the separation of powers between the judicial, executive, and legislative branches. Don't get terribly bogged down with the history of all this. Many of it, or much of it, you may have already heard in your education in the past. And, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on a lot of the history. Just because I do think it's just kind of foundational, and if you've heard it before or have an understanding, you don't need to go over it again. With the Commerce Clause, we're again building foundations that will give us some perspective on what we're going to deal with later. And what the Commerce Clause is all about is that Congress has the ability to regulate trade with foreign nations, and also regulate interstate commerce. And along with that goes the Dormant Commerce Clause, which says that if Congress doesn't provide a regulation, the state might go ahead and provide their own regulation, although the Supreme Court still has the ability to evaluate and limit any state legislation that might be discriminatory and perhaps might create an undue burden on the organization. And then also, too, the federal government has the right of preemption and supremacy in the whole thing, in all the legislation. And you may have heard kind of the three-layer cake. I think I said it last week, and you might have heard that before, is you have 3 layers to the legislative and supremacy cake, and the top of the heap is the federal government, and then comes state, and then comes local government. And the bottom layers can't take over the domain of the upper layer. And that's something that time and time again people don't understand. Like in Southern Oregon here, I always hear people saying, well, let's just pass a law and take over the national forests or the state forests. And I try to explain to them, well, you really can't do that because of the supremacy of the federal government. They are watching out for the national forests on behalf of all the people, not just the people locally. And you can't do that, and sometimes it's hard for people to understand that. I think everyone's heard about the Bill of Rights, and the first 10 amendments of the Constitution are considered the Bill of Rights, and the first amendment is primarily freedom of speech, and that just gives people the ability to speak freely without government interference, and that gets into political speech and our businesses and organizations, political bodies. And there is the most recent case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, where the Supreme Court ruled that organizations, businesses are considered people and do have the right to freedom of speech. Otherwise, in other situations, you have the Fourth Amendment that protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures, and basically the same thing goes for your business or organization. A government official just can't come into your business and start getting into your records, your documents, or looking through your organization's warehouses, etc., without some sort of search warrant. And this gets a little bit complex when we talk about different agencies, and say, for example, if OSHA comes in, what do they have the right to look at? And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that later. Then you have the Fifth Amendment, which says you have due process, and it just, in any type of governmental action, you have the right to hear evidence against you and have the chance to respond to that evidence. And then the 14th Amendment, which is basically, again, due process and equal protection, just means that you as a person and also your organization will be given the same treatment as any other organization. For example, legislation cannot favor your competitors over you. And as you're reading through this, you can skip the cases in this chapter and the exercises in this chapter, and just cover the basic areas that I just described, and you'll be in good shape. In Chapter 5, we're going to start looking at administrative agencies and laws. And you probably have had some experience with administrative agencies. For example, the Department of Motor Vehicles is the one most students have had the most experience with. Usually not good experience, but I always tell students it's a lot better than it was 30 years ago. The lines were a lot longer, the procedures were more complex, and nowadays it's, even though you might think it's awful, it's still pretty smooth. But administrative agencies are created because we have all these regulations and laws that are put forth by federal branches of Congress, state legislatures, and say local city councils or county commissions and such. So if you have all these rules and regulations and laws, how do you enforce them? Well, you create agencies to do that. For example, EPA handles all the different environmental protection laws. Laws in the county, criminal laws are handled by your county sheriff's office. City laws are handled by your local police department. And there's other things too. You might have a human services division of your city, depending on how big it is, or you might have a human services division of your state. Might be the group that handles the entire state, rather than different specific municipal or local agencies. And the regulations, you might look at, oh gosh, why do we need all these laws and regulations? Remember from our first week, we want everybody to be treated fairly, and we want the rules to apply to everyone, and we want to promote safety and just general equal treatment. And that's why we have the rules, and then we have the agencies that make sure that happens. We have also independent agencies, and these are agencies that are created to be independent, that they don't have a lot of oversight by a specific government agency. You might have the Public Utilities Commission, and that's an example of a independent agencies, but you might say, well, they're not really independent because in many cases the utilities commissioners are appointed by your governor or by your legislature. So how fair can they be? Well, they do have some abilities above and beyond, let's say, like your some of your locally controlled organizations. And the control can be by legislative mandate. It can be by the executive branch, and in some cases, for example, Department of Human Services is controlled not only by the director, but the governor. The governor appoints the director, and so can pretty much craft the organization the way that she or he sees fit. And then you also have judicial review. The local courts, your state courts, or the federal court can look at something that the agency is doing and through judicial review and say, nope, sorry, that you're wrong. You can't be doing that. It's not fair. Also, the administrative agencies have their own remedies for dealing with things, own rules and regulations that they're trying to enforce, that they have specifically for them. And if you run afoul of that, you have an administrative hearing, which is different than a court of law. You have an administrative judge. The administrative judge hears the case. It's not a court. It's usually pretty quick, or a lot faster than you'd experience in the court system. And at the end of the hearing, the judge will issue an opinion. And if you don't like the opinion, only that after you've gone through every process you possibly can within that administrative area, can you ask for a judicial review or a judicial remedy. But many people are familiar with administrative agencies because of the paperwork, the inspections. I mentioned OSHA earlier. There's federal OSHA, there's state OSHA. There's, say, local, you have a building department or a planning department that might control building projects or safety within facilities. There's, say, for example, the fire department has a code enforcement officer to look at fire codes. And so you do need administrative agencies. They help things run smoothly. And but you do have administrative remedies, especially if you can prove that the agency perhaps has overstepped their boundaries or are treating you in a discriminatory manner. That gives you a brief look at administrative agencies. We'll be looking at those in more detail as we go along. As I mentioned here, you can skip the cases in this chapter, And I'm also using the Ford Pinto example to give you an idea of the evolution of consumer protection. And also NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, is an example of a federal administrative agency. So you can see that that example through the 60s and 70s and up into present day about how they have evolved to change their outlook on product safety in the automotive industry. And then also that case also gives you sort of the question of, gosh, who should be regulating this product? Should it just be individual states? Should each state have its own rules for automotive products, or should it be the federal government? And that's something that we're going to be looking at in a number of areas, not just automotive, but it gives you an idea of the evolution of this whole process. And you can see it happening right now in the social media arena. You see right now with Facebook, the federal government and the Congress are looking more and more at Facebook and saying, should we regulate social media? And so we're really, comparatively speaking, we're really sort of at the beginning of what the Ford Pinto faced. Gosh, what kind of rules should we have on safety for cars, given that it's 1969, 1970? That's where we're at right now with social media. What kind of rules should we have to protect people's privacy and safety? And here we are in 2019 having that discussion. Who knows where that will lead? Well, I don't think I made it in under 10 minutes, but hopefully it'll be in under 17 minutes, which was the time on week 1. My last thoughts, please read the weekly overview, stay current, and start looking at executive briefing number 1. Start examining that and be thinking about how you would answer those questions. Go ahead and read the summary here, and I'd just like to leave you with this. It is an increasingly complex area, the area that we're studying about law and ethics, and it is ever changing. I started teaching this about 12 years ago, and just the changes I've seen in the last 12 years are just breathtaking. So consider that. Always, even after this class, always try to stay current with the changes in organizational and business law and with organizational ethics, because they do change, and you can get out ahead of those changes if you stay current. Have a pleasant week, and please email me if you have any questions.